Hello everybody, we are coming in for today's video, which we will finally kind of move on here a little bit from last week. I've decided that we will hit our second president today out of 45, soon to be 46, so we are going to go ahead and hit the second president today in our president series. I just kind of started looking over our options right currently, and this is kind of what we're pointing toward for this week. So, for our second president video, we will go on who our second president was, since we're doing these in order. So, we covered George Washington last week. If you have not seen that video, do be sure to check that one out if you have not seen it. And otherwise, well, I would suggest that if you've not seen that video, you might want to watch it, catch up, or you can probably just watch this one anyway and then go watch it, because each president was somewhat separate in their own way. So, today we are going to cover the second president of the United States as part of our president series, and that is none other than founding father John Adams. In case none of you, I'm sure most of you have probably seen or heard of John Adams some point in your life, probably in school, but in case you've forgotten who that was, he looked like this. This was John Adams. He was our second president and one of our foremost founding fathers. We will show his photo again here when needed. So, in this video is going to be a little bit different in our focus of what we're going to discuss here. As I know when I did George Washington, I largely just focused on his presidency. Well, this one we're kind of discuss a little bit more of the aspects of Adams's life prior to him becoming president, given the fact that his presidency wasn't all that eventful. Given that he only served one term, he was our very first president to only serve a single term in office. And he was the first president to lose a re-election bid, which I know, especially right now, that's kind of a big hot topic of debate. So anyway, we're going to go ahead here and get started. So we're going to discuss what John Adams' background was. What did he do before he was president? Where did he come from? How did he grow up? Who was he? And as we mentioned, he's a founding father, so he played a very critical role in the American Revolution in helping the United States to become an independent, free nation. John Adams was born on October 30th of 1735 in Braintree, which is now Quincy, Massachusetts. He was the eldest of three sons to his parents of John and Susanna. And fun factor, John Adams was actually a descendant of the Pilgrims from the Mayflower. He had some of his ancestors were on that ship and had come over here on that, so he could trace his lineage back to the Pilgrims. So that's kind of just a fun fact. Adams had a very happy childhood most of the time. His dad was very adamant with him. He tried to teach him as much as he could, and Adams very much respected his father. Now, his mother sometimes, she kind of ran the household. His mom and dad kind of come into a couple quarrels once in a while, but Adams largely had a happy childhood with his parents, and he especially grew to admire his father. Adams learned to read very early on, as his dad, of course, inspired him to kind of take up the academic skills as quickly as he could by telling his son as soon as he was able to read, he had his son start reading the Bible. Adams struggled to find a career in life that he wanted to do, though, and this was probably one of the driving decisions in Adams's early life, was trying to find where did he think he belonged in life, what career did he think might suit him. At one point when he was a boy, he thought he would be a farmer like his father was, and his father's like, you don't want to do this, John. So he doesn't do the farming. So he kind of goes around trying to think of his options. His parents would prefer if he were to go into the ministry, which was very high in colonial society, and that was actually one of the highest positions you could obtain if you were born in the colonies. So, of course, they were like, well, why don't you join the ministry? You'll get a good position, it'll be high power, a lot of money. So they try to press John to do this, and for a couple of years, John actually tries to pursue this goal of becoming a part of the ministry in the colonies. And part of the way he does this is at age 15, he enters Harvard College. I know, that sounds a little weird. Nowadays, you got to be like 20 or so to even go to college, or 19, 18, as soon as you graduate. But no, because keep in mind, back then, we didn't have K through 12 schools. Most of the time back then, some kids never even got an education, and the highest that you usually would have got, if you actually went to a public school or anything, would have been maybe 6th, 8th grade. And even then, this is colonial time. So really, if you're really thinking about it, most of these people, they didn't always go to a schoolhouse. They commonly would have like a private tutor or something like that who would be teaching them, or their own parents. But Adams was gifted enough from his parents that he was able to go to school, and he was able to then enter and get accepted into Harvard College, Harvard University, whatever you want to call it. They are the oldest college here in the United States, and they were even there back here in John Adams' time. They were formed in the 1600s, I believe, is when they were founded. So John Adams, he went to Harvard in 1751 at the age of 15, and he graduated 4 years later. However, Adams, upon graduating from Harvard in 1755, Adams kind of finally came to the decision that ministry was not going to be his port of call either, because he didn't think he had the right attitude or temperament to really become a minister. He didn't really think he could restrain himself enough. So he started thinking of what else he could do, and while he's doing this, he takes a teaching job as a school teacher at a small school in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he is a young school teacher at this time, and he does this for about 2 years. While he is at this school, though, in Worcester, Massachusetts, right across the street from the schoolhouse, there is the Worcester, let me see here what it was, I'm going off my notebook here. He goes to the Worcester Courthouse, which is right across the street. And he becomes very interested because he goes once in a while, when he gets a break or so, or after classes are done, he goes to the Worcester Courthouse and goes to watch the cases that are being held in court. And most primarily, John focuses on the lawyers. He focuses on how the lawyers argue their cases. And he becomes extremely intrigued by lawyers. He likes lawyers. He likes the idea of being a lawyer because he kind of decides that a lawyer is somewhat like a minister, except they can more freely express their opinions and beliefs and not have to adhere to a certain way code as a ministry might have to. And because of this, John not only becomes affixed to the lawyers and the practice of law, but he decides that I want to take up a career in law. I want to become a lawyer. So John starts, and this is where John finds his calling. John Adams was probably one of the most successful lawyers in Massachusetts during his time. So he took up a career in law, and that was what he was meant to do. It was his calling. John inherited the family farm that his father had operated in 1761 when his father died of the flu, which of course hurt John immensely because, as we mentioned, he was very close to his father. However, he kind of relieved his depression a couple years later, where in 1764, he married the young Abigail Smith, who then became Abigail Adams. And she was very influential on John. Abigail was John's wife basically until she died. She died before John did. They had one of the happiest marriages ever known of any presidential couple. And Abigail was most of the time, she was John's closest confidant. He would tell her everything, and he would trust her to try to advise him, to try to work with him on things, to try to tell him, what do you think I should do? Or, do you think this is right? Or, do you want to do this? He would very much entrust to his wife his trust and full confidence. And they definitely were a working pair of couple. And of course, they did have kids. They had a total of 6 children. However, only 4 of them actually lived to be adults. 2 of them did die very early on. And of the 4 that they did have to live to adulthood were Abigail, Charles, Thomas, and John Quincy. Now, John Quincy, you're going to see later on in this series because he is, it's one of the only 2 pairs of presidents that we have. John Adams and his son John Quincy both became president. John Quincy would later become our 6th president, and the only other pair of father and son presidents that we have is the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. So you will see John Quincy here later on in the series. As we kind of go through this and discuss our presidents, we will get to John Quincy here, I would say, if at the earliest late this month. If not, I would definitely say we're going to get to him in January. So this kind of covers John's life up to the outbreak of the American Revolution, the revolutionary feelings in the British American colonies. And as this breaks out, after the French and Indian War concludes and Britain starts slapping its taxes on American colonies, believing that they should help pay for the cost of the debt that Britain has ensued with the war because they had gained the most. And of course, the protests start. There's no taxation without representation is the crawl and everything else. Now, where did John stand? Now, John was in Massachusetts, and as I think we all know from history class at any point, Massachusetts was probably the central hotbed of rebellious activity during the pre-Revolutionary War years, where protests were gaining up. Massachusetts was the hotbed of patriot and kind of rebel activity. It was definitely the area that garnered the most support of anti-British views. Now, Adams is from here, and he very much becomes entrenched with this. In fact, fun fact here, Samuel Adams, who was the head of the, what were they called here? I'm trying to think. The Sons of Liberty in Boston that helped organize the Boston Tea Party. He was a second cousin to John Adams. They were related. So he has one cousin that's very much a firebrand. He's very much where he wants to go with the British, and so his own views don't differ that much either. John very much is on the Patriot side from the get-go. He does not favor Britain in any way. He sees the taxes as wrong, and in fact, John openly protests the Stamp Act that Britain passed during 1765 and the Townshend Acts that soon follow, that placed taxes on many of the British goods that were being shipped to the colonies. John does not just privately argue against these, he's publicly arguing against these. However, he did have a softer side to him. Specifically, this came to light in 1770 when the Boston Massacre occurred. After the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers opened fire into an unruly crowd in March of 1770 and killed 5 colonists, the British soldiers were, of course, brought to trial on charges that they had committed open murder without cause. Well, they need a lawyer to represent the soldiers, and you will never guess who volunteers to represent these British soldiers. It is none other than John Adams. And John Adams defends them not because he had any personal affection for the soldiers or felt bad for their situation, but because he deemed that they need to ensure that the soldiers get a fair trial. They might be guilty, but they still need a fair trial, just as any other citizen needs. So Adams did very much represent the British soldiers in the court case that soon followed. Only one of the soldiers, I believe, actually got anything done, and even then I don't think he was executed or nothing. He was just kind of kicked out of the army for a little bit, or demoted. But he really sensed that even though I oppose Britain, I'm not going to be a jerk and deny these men their rights that they properly have. In 1774, Adams attends the First Continental Congress, and then he also attends the Second Continental Congress in 1775 that was brought together in Philadelphia after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And Adams is the one responsible for George Washington becoming Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army because he was the very first to nominate Washington to command it. And, of course, everyone else at the Congress followed lead after John had kind of made the nomination, which in the long run was a vital step toward American independence, because if we did not have George Washington leading the Continental Army, we may not have been an independent nation. Adams was also responsible for nominating Thomas Jefferson a year later to draft the Declaration of Independence, as he was a member of the Continental Congress, that kind of the congressional body that was governing basically the rebellion, the colonies, whatever you want to call them. And Thomas Jefferson was rapidly becoming one of Adams's good friends, and so was Benjamin Franklin. The trio were very close friends during this time, and it was Adams who suggested and nominated that Thomas Jefferson be the one to draft a declaration because he was impressed with Jefferson's writing skills. And he told Jefferson, he's like, I think you need to be the one to write it because you write better than anyone else that I've seen. Even though Jefferson was younger than Adams, he acknowledged that he was the far better writer. And Jefferson largely owed his Congress's decision to appoint him to draft the Declaration to Adams. And during his writing of the Declaration, Jefferson did, of course, consult with Adams, and he consulted with Benjamin Franklin as well. He did consult with them and ask for their views of what he thought maybe we should leave out or something like that, just kind of give him advice on writing it, but everything else Jefferson wrote. And they gave some small suggestions, but largely thought that Jefferson had done a good job. After the Declaration was passed, Adams continued to serve as a member of the Continental Congress as he became a diplomatic negotiator for the United States. And for the remainder of the war, he was in Europe. He was not here in the colonies. He was with Ben Franklin in Europe trying to negotiate deals and treaties. And soon John Jay also, I remember, came along with them. And John Jay, as we discussed in the George Washington video, was a very prominent diplomat at that time who later became our first Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, So Adams goes to Europe for the rest of the war, and he's helping to try to gain American recognition in Europe of the new country that has come to be formed. And he's kind of instrumental in trying to secure French aid from the France, who declares that they will aid America in 1778 after the Americans win the Battle of Saratoga. So they kind of come through and say, oh, we're going to help you now. So Adams and Ben Franklin and John Jay are over there in Europe trying to negotiate the aid, that France give them aid to help them. And at the end of the war, Adams is very instrumental because he, Ben Franklin, and John Jay and another diplomat are the ones that actually negotiate the 1783 Treaty of Paris between the United States and Great Britain, which formally recognizes America's independence from Great Britain. So Adams was very instrumental in getting that treaty created, drafted, and signed. So he played a vital part in the American Revolution. It's just he wasn't a soldier, he was a diplomat, he was a politician. Now, it is very interesting to note here that we mentioned that Adams was in Europe and he was securing aid, and he helped secure French aid after France had declared that they would ally with us. However, Adams was, unlike Jefferson and Franklin, now Jefferson was not with him, but Franklin was, Adams did not have the most positive view of France, even though France was helping the United States. And this was mostly due to the factor that Adams very quickly realized what I've realized from my historical readings is what he actually realized in real life, and it's that France was not involving itself with the American Revolution so that it might help a new country to be free. France didn't see it as helping out a new country. What France saw it as was an opportunity to get back at Britain for the insult they had been delivered at the French and Indian War. In France's true opinion, they could care less if the United States came out of it alive or not. All they wanted was to add an insult to Britain of some sort by having them lose some of their colonies, as France had been forced to lose its North American possessions in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. And Adams very much realized this. He realized that the French were not in this for American independence. They were in this for their own personal causes. And he very much kind of somewhat resented the French because of this. He was very cautious. He cautioned Dr. Franklin to be very careful when negotiating with the French because, as Adams termed it in his own words, they provide us with enough aid to keep us in the fight and keep us from drowning in the water, and they hold our head up so that we don't drown, but not enough to actually help us out of the water, to actually get us out of there and get us fully on track to win this war immediately. And Adams was, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because there will come when we get to Adams's presidency here very shortly, the issue of war between Britain and France becomes a very big issue during his presidency, and his personal views toward France kind of shape his decision of how he handles that crisis. So keep in mind, even though France helps us in the American Revolution, Adams is one of the few politicians to really kind of think twice about it and really think, well, why is France really helping us? Are they really helping us because they like the idea of us being independent? That ain't why. It's just to get an insult at the British, and they probably wouldn't even fear the United States because they deem the United States as a brand new nation. It's weak. It's powerless. It can't do nothing. So this is during the rest of the war. Now, after the war concludes and the United States is fully independent, Adams continues to serve with the Continental Congress. And between 1785 and 1788, he was appointed as the United States' first ambassador to Great Britain, where he held a couple audiences actually, with Britain's King George III. Now, Adams was very worried when he went to meet King George because, of course, he knew that King George had heard who he was, what he had done during the Revolution. Of course, George probably saw him as somewhat of a traitor still. May I add, when the American colonies broke away and became the United States, when Britain finally recognized it, King George was very much against that treaty even then. And he acknowledged this when he met Adams. He said, "I would like to tell you, and I'm being quite honest, that I was the last to consent to independence. I did not want to do it, and I was the very last to consent to it." But George, very quickly, in a stunning move, kind of tried to tried to subdue Adams's fears, because he stated that although I may have been the last to consent to American independence, I would very much love to be the very first to extend the hand of friendship to the United States. George kind of quelled Adams' fears with that statement, and they had a small talk about Adams' loyalties, which, of course, it was quite evident that Adams was not exactly pro-French like most of his fellow Americans, and George recognized this, because, of course, Britain ain't gonna like an American because they're pro-French, and he recognized that Adams was one of the few that was not, and he kind of questioned Adams about it a little bit. Adams kind of replied that his only true loyalty was to his country, and George, in a kind of move that was kind of saying that I respect that, kind of made the comment to him. He told him that only an honest man ever is. Only an honest man is ever loyal to his country. So Adams really established UK-American relations, US-UK relations, as the first ambassador we had to Great Britain, which was a monumental role because, keep in mind, that was the country we just 2 or 3 years ago at that point in time had just broken away from, and they're still pretty bitter about losing us. So Adams had his work cut out, but he navigated it very skillfully. Upon returning in 1788 from being ambassador, as Adams stepped down and decided to return home to the United States for the first time since the end of the war, he participated in the Constitutional Convention and was one of the very first to nominate that George Washington be elected as president. He himself lobbied for the vice presidential position that was created by the U.S. Constitution, and he won it. Adams was our very first vice president. He was vice president to George Washington. Now, Adams did not view the vice presidency very well, though, because of a couple things that happened. Adams's time was probably the most negative of his entire life, and it's quite clear from his own writings, from his own sayings, that he didn't like being vice president that much. Although Washington knew Adams, and although Washington did share many of his political beliefs and other ideas along with Adams, Washington surprisingly didn't really consult Adams all that too much during his 2 terms of office. He really didn't consult with his vice president that much. He really didn't. He really didn't consult with him on anything. Now, today, you look at it and you're like, well, the president's always talking to the vice president. Well, that's true. Well, for some reason, early on, Washington didn't do this. And, of course, this makes Adams feel inferior because he's like, okay, do I just not matter? I'm supposed to be like your backup here, but apparently I don't matter. And the only real task that Adams really got that he could actually perform was being president of the Senate, which is what the Constitution dictates that the vice president acts as. However, as per the Constitution, although the vice president is the president of the Senate, the vice president does not have any voting power in the Senate unless there is a tie. If there is a tie in the Senate, since the Senate is divided evenly because there's 2 senators, each state gets 2 senators no matter what their size, there's always an even number. Say there's a tie, like right now, we got 100 senators in the Senate. Let's say we got a tie vote. Let's say there's 50 senators for this bill and there's 50 senators against it. Well, that's a tie. That's where the vice president comes in. That is the only time the vice president can vote to act as a tiebreaker. Whoever he votes with, that's going to add 51. That's going to break that tie. But that's the only time the vice president has any voting power in the Senate. Otherwise, he can watch the Senate anytime he wants. It's just, unless there's a tie, he has no voting power. And this was Adams's only real task that he really got to perform during Washington's 8-year administration. However, he did break probably more ties than any other vice president. He broke at least 31 tie votes in the Senate. However, due to that this was really his only task, Adams was very bored by the vice presidency. He didn't like it. He disliked it immensely. He was kind of isolated from the president and from the cabinet. He deemed he really had no role. He was just a figurehead, just kind of standing in the shadows. And Adams even later made the very well-documented saying of what he described the vice presidency as. And he described it as the most, and this is in his own words, and I quote, "the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Adams was bored out of his mind as vice president. He deemed, I'm just sitting here doing nothing. However, during Washington's presidency, due to the fact that he had nothing to do, he was very much able to, unlike Washington, start kind of aligning his political future and deem where do I stand in politics as political parties are beginning to form. And it soon becomes very apparent that Adams is beginning to align his political beliefs with that of Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who becomes the head of the Federalist Party, which were very pro-government, a lot of like government regulation, thinks the government needs to have a good hand in the running of the economy, where the Republicans, later the Democratic Republicans, which are primarily led by Adams's good friend Thomas Jefferson, are primarily like anti-government, like hands-off, kind of laissez-faire, as they would call it. It was a French term for like an open economy where the government really doesn't regulate too much. Adams very much believes in a strong, central, powerful, authoritative government that has the power to take action when needed, and this aligns him into Hamilton's camp during Washington's presidency. When Washington announces in 1796 that he will not run for a third term, this opens up a presidential election for the first time, and this also makes it sure that the 1796 presidential election becomes the very first between political parties, where there is two different candidates, two major presidential candidates from two different political parties. Adams is nominated to be the Federalist candidate in the 1796 election, and of course the Federalists deem that why wouldn't you vote Adams in? He's been Washington's vice president for 8 years. It's like Washington's proper successor. He knows the position. When he didn't, because he was bored out of his mind, and he didn't have that much responsibility. And before we go on here, right here, this is a $10 bill, but in case you did not know, this is Alexander Hamilton, who was the head of the Federalist Party and kind of was the one that Adams had to work a lot with when he was president because he identified with that party. This is Alexander Hamilton. He was our first Secretary of the Treasury. That's why he's on the $10 bill. That's why he's one of the few non-presidents to be on a dollar bill. He would have been the first person to really issue money that was American. So in 1796, Adams becomes the Federalist candidate for president. And who becomes the Republicans candidate? Not the current Republicans. We're going to call them Democratic Republicans, as that's what they later called themselves. Who becomes the Democratic Republicans candidate? None other than Adams's best friend, Thomas Jefferson. It's two best friends running against each other for president. Adams and Jefferson are running in 1796. In the presidential election of 1796, there were 138 votes in the Electoral College, as the state of Tennessee had been admitted just prior to the election. That's bringing that total up. By this point, you have the original 13 states plus the states of Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee have been admitted. So you have now a 138 vote total in the Electoral College. Adams won against Jefferson by a very slim margin. In order to win the election with 138 votes total in the Electoral College, you needed to get a majority just like today. A majority of 138 would have been 69 votes. Adams barely beat Jefferson by obtaining 71 votes compared to Jefferson's 68. It was very tight. It was a very tight race, and Adams clinched it. And in case you don't see it here, let me make sure I got the right one. Yes. This is our electoral map of the 1796 election, the first between two political parties. The green states went for Jefferson. The orange went for Adams. Adams, of course, was very strong in New England, especially Massachusetts. That was his home. New England is his home area. He's from Massachusetts, so of course he gets these states. He also nabbed some electoral votes from states down here. Adams barely beats out Jefferson. It was a very, very close race, but this is how he wins in 1796. Remember, we are talking about this man. He's running against his very good friend, none other than Mr. Thomas Jefferson. I'm trying to get this in a good light. He's on your nickel. And if you got a $2 bill, he's on that too. And when we get to the third president, he is our next president that we'll have to talk about because he does win the third presidency spot. So in March 1797, after he wins the election of 1796, Adams becomes the president-elect, and in March of 1797, as George Washington leaves office, Adams becomes president. He becomes the second president of the United States. However, it was kind of doomed from the beginning because Adams was somewhat viewed as just a third term of Washington. He wasn't really viewed as his own separate political entity. Now, Adams took office on March 4th, and at the same time, Thomas Jefferson becomes his vice president. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, he didn't run with Jefferson. Well, yes, that is right, but keep in mind that prior to the 12th Amendment that was passed in 1804 that regulated that there be a separate vote for president and vice president and all that matter, the presidential election system dictated that whoever gained the most votes nationally would be president, whoever gained the second most would be vice, which kind of created an awkward situation where you could have a president that is a member of one political party and a vice president who is the member of entirely opposite political party. But keep in mind, the Constitution frameworkers didn't really picture political parties ever forming, so that's not exactly something they foresaw. So due to this, Adams is a Federalist. He's the president. And although Thomas Jefferson is his friend, they become increasingly argumentative and very hostile toward each other because although Adams is a Federalist, Jefferson is he's the head of the Democratic Republican Party. He's the opposite on the political scale. So you've got a president and a vice president who really outright hate each other politically, and they aren't going to really work together all that well. And because Jefferson had gotten the second highest number of votes, he gets the vice presidency. Now, Adams faced critics almost as soon as he entered the office because he was deemed that he was not of George Washington's fame. He was not of George Washington's stature. And some people kind of made fun of him because Adams was not as tall as Washington. He was kind of a short little guy, and truth be told, he was just a tad bit obese. Just a tad bit, not massively. But people kind of were quick to make fun of his stature by calling him his rotundity. Kind of basically saying, you're fat. Adams didn't like that very much at all, but this was very early on in his administration that he got this. Now, Adams' administration was very quickly consumed with a growing tension between the United States and France, which during that time we're going to call it Revolutionary France because the French Revolution had broken out in 1789. The king had been executed in 1793, so by this point, France is just an upheaval. It's still in that revolutionary stage where it's just battling Great Britain and all the other European powers. Napoleon is not in power yet, but his power base is slowly growing at that time. So we go on here, and as I mentioned earlier, we mentioned Adams' kind of disdain for France, and this is where that's going to actually come into play. In 1795, George Washington, as we called in our last video, I did mention this, but just to recap. In 1795, President George Washington had issued a neutrality proclamation when Great Britain and France once again went to war. He declared that the United States was neutral, that it would not favor either side, and maintained that the United States had neutral trading rights with both nations. Trade could not be restricted with either nation for any reason, given that it was a neutral country. Now, revolutionary France, of course, this kind of ticks France off. And why does this tick them off? Well, they see it as a betrayal of America. They believe that America has betrayed them. And they see, and to be fair, I'm not going to exactly say their view was wrong, because France said, we helped you gain independence, and now you're not even going to help us? So France is very much feeling backstabbed at that moment. They're like, we helped you, and you won't even help us. How's that go? And France is somewhat ticked off by this neutrality proclamation. They thought that the United States would come rushing to their aid because they had helped them to win independence in the first place. So France is very much upset, and in response to this, France begins seizing American merchant vessels on the high seas. And by 1797, when Adams takes office, they've seized over 300 American merchant vessels, just commercial vessels that are trading goods on the Atlantic. And this causes a bad disaster back in the United States. It causes insurance on shipping rates to go up by up to 500%. And the American economy starts getting hurt because, A, goods aren't getting traded, and B, insurance rates are spiking because now you're not so certain your cargo is going to get over to Europe without being stopped and taken by a French vessel. So in late 1797, Adams sent 3 commissioners to France in an effort to try to negotiate a peaceful settlement with the French revolutionary government as to what they could do to end this little seizure of American merchant vessels. Now, the French foreign minister and the French directory, which were the French government, they refused to even begin negotiations with the American diplomats because they want a bribe paid in order to open up the negotiations, saying, sure, we'll open up negotiations, but you got to pay us a little bit of money first. A little bribe. Basically saying, no money, no negotiations. Word of this gets back to the United States in the spring of 1798, and this sparks wildfire across the country as people are insulted. They believe that they know that France is trying to bribe them, but they're like, how dare they? We're a brand new nation, and already you're trying to backstab us. You're trying to force us to have to pay something in order to get a certain way that we need. If they took it as an insult to American pride, to American sovereignty, and the American people were so inflamed by this affair that they wanted war declared on France. And Adams informed Congress of the incident and referred to the Frenchmen in question not by name, but referred to them by using the letters of X, Y, and Z. And so this whole affair becomes known as the XYZ affair. Now, people, as we mentioned, they're ticked off. They want war with France. Congress, in return, since they're elected by the people, and some of these people that want war are in Congress, they're very much preparing for war against France. Congress authorizes that construction of 3 new naval frigates and multiple new naval ships, and even passes money to be used to raise a provisional army. And George Washington is even called to possibly be on standby in case they need someone to command the army. They send a letter to him asking that if we come to war, will you lead us once again? Which he actually did accept, but it never came down to that. Now, keep in mind, Adams's party is largely behind this because they're very anti-French. The Federalists were very pro-British. They were very anti-French. They were an anti-French party compared to Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who were very pro-French and anti-British, which we're going to see about 2 decades down the road is going to have a more grateful impact in the presidency of our 4th president, James Madison, which we've already discussed that war that came about, the War of 1812, but that is largely a result of that political mindset. But the Federalists were very anti-French, and of course, the Federalists dominate both houses of Congress. They have the majority in both houses, and they control the presidency. So they very much deemed, let's go to war with France. Well, Adams, although there was demand, both popular and congressional, for war to be declared on France, keep in mind the Constitution says that the president must ask for war to be declared before Congress can just declare it. It has to be asked for. And although Adams was somewhat in line with believing that something needed to be done, he also realized out of the greatness of his own intellectual ability that we can't fight a war. We can't afford one right now. We don't have the money. We don't have the army. We don't have a navy. Well, we had them all, but we had nothing of the scale the French had, and he realized very quickly, if we go to war with France, we'll be destroyed. We will not come out of this alive. So Adams, as much as he was in agreement, he did paint the bigger picture here. He's like, as much as I want to, I know we can't afford to, and I'm not going to have us do it. So Adams did a very smart decision on that part by instead, he hesitated to do anything. He very much didn't want a war, so he never asked for a declaration of war. And he continued to want to negotiate with France, which caused some critics to come about in his own party because they start viewing him as weak. They start viewing him as, well, you're pro-French. Well, Adams like, I'm not pro-French, but I'm not pro to kill America either. So this starts some critics against him who deem that Adams as being too weak in the face of French intervention and all that. Now, without Adams even declaring war, there were already skirmishes going on the high seas in the Atlantic between French vessels and American vessels as American ships began arming themselves and literally going to battle with France. It was literally a naval war going on between the United States and France in 1798 and 1799, even though that no state of war was declared between the two countries. France didn't declare war, and neither did the United States, but yet their ships are fighting on the ocean. It took about another year and a half before a peaceful settlement was finally reached and the situation was formally dissolved peacefully. But at this point in time, Adams was being called a coward. He was being called weak because they deemed that you're a member of our own party and you won't even support war with France. Now, Adams tried to show his strength by doing something else, though, because he deemed that he'd been kind of shown to be somewhat weak with the hesitancy to declare war on France, and he does this in 1798 by signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which we have also discussed previously, and I will provide a little thing here at the end of the video in case you have not seen that. You may go back and see it. But this, instead of helping Adams' reputation, this only worsens it, and in fact, very likely it cost him the presidency. The Alien and Sedition Acts were two laws that came about that it was due to the fear of the time. The fear of the time was we have all these aliens coming into the country. Aliens means foreigners, people from Europe, people from outside of the country was an alien, as they called them back then. They didn't call them immigrants. And you have all these aliens coming in. They wondered they're going to take away our jobs. They're going to act as spies. They're going to try to spy for the enemy or whatever. They were fearful of the aliens. And at the same time, you had these people that if it did come to war with France or something like that, or there's going to be critics. And on top of that, you're going to have these politicians, even if there isn't war, these newspapers and people like that that are openly critical of a government. And the Federalists thought that, well, if you have a government that people are just slandering and outright insulting, it won't function right. So they deemed it was a threat. And Adams very much supports this view and passes signs the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically, to put it bluntly, made it a crime to speak out against the government. If you were caught speaking ill about a politician or any governmental institution, you could be fined or thrown in jail. It was basically a blatant violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, but it basically gave the impression that Adams was saying, well, that's a nice idea, but we're not really going to do that. So, although that was not Adams' intent at all, it very much became viewed that it was his intent to become some sort of a monarch, to become some sort of an authoritarian dictator, and it very much worsened his reputation to the point that it cost him the presidency. In the election of 1800, Adams lost re-election to Vice President Jefferson by a narrow margin, but he did lose. And we're going to get back. And Adams was the very first president that had run for re-election and failed to win a second term, kind of like Donald Trump has done here recently, which we see now, and so have other presidents. But Adams, even though he was defeated, even though he had a bitter rivalry, at this point he wasn't even talking to Jefferson anymore, his own vice president. They had not talked at all. He kind of just stayed shut up and wouldn't talk to him at all, even though they had been formerly best friends. And although Adams very much hated Jefferson's political beliefs, although he very much hated that he had lost, Adams did set a presidential precedent, and the precedent that he set was that if you lose a reelection bid, and this is the one that's highly in debate today. It was Adams who really started this, and Adams was the one that said, if I lose a reelection bid, I'm not going to whine, I'm not going to pout, I'm not going to try to argue and try to say I won or whatever else happens here. Adams very much set the precedent that you concede to your opponent if you've lost, and you accept defeat, and you peacefully transfer that power to your successor. It was very many fears at the time, at the election of 1800, that it could come to war. There were some fears at the time that the American people were that politically divided that it could come to war, that Adams and Jefferson would just kind of continuously go at it. They wouldn't accept defeat if one of them lost. But Adams ultimately, who the one that lost, he set the best of precedents by declaring that I might have lost, but I'm not going to be a sore loser. I will accept what has been said. And Adams, although he didn't accomplish a whole lot during his term, this was probably one of the defining moments that he did, and it's probably one of the greatest. So he did succeed in doing something memorable. Now, you look today, and I'm sorry, I got to say it. It embarrasses me and my personal opinion that President Trump has become the very first president that I've read about or known about. No, I'm not even going to say read about or known about. I know about. No, I mean, I know. I've read every president. He's the only one to ever do this. He's the very first to do this. And in my personal opinion, I don't know what yours is, but I'm going to say it right here and now, because I got to say, I'm not going to lie to you. In my very personal opinion, I think it's a crying shame. I think it's a crying shame that a president of the United States who has, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and say this too. At this point, I think it's become increasingly clear. I think he has definitely lost. I don't think there's any way you can really even try to argue that he hasn't. I mean, sure, you claim fraud, but every time I'm watching the news just like the rest of you are. I'm watching the news every day, looking for what I can of what's going on. And every time I see these court cases, I listen to them. I'm listening like, okay, what do they got to say? I hate to tell you this, people, but every time I look at it, I'm seeing they claim this evidence is there, and maybe it is. Maybe it is. But every time they're in court, they fail to provide that evidence. They claim it's there, but there's a difference between claiming and actually being able to back it up when you're actually in court, where it could actually make a difference, when it could change things. And every time I've watched one of these things, I'm not seeing any change. I'm seeing nothing but blatant, made-up crap, to put it bluntly. So, in my personal opinion, Donald Trump is somewhat making I'm not going to say it's a bad move. Oh, no, it is a bad move. But as for his personal political career, I don't know what it will do. But as for, in my personal view, and I'm sure a lot of other Americans too, that maybe somewhat respect some of the presidential traditions that have been so endemic to this country, they're going to not view that very, very positively, because this tradition of peacefully transferring power, of conceding, it's been a constant in American democracy ever since Adams lost to Jefferson about, my God, that was over 200 years ago. 220 years ago. Right? Yeah, 220 years ago. And it took until now that we have a president who has lost a re-election bid like Adams did, but has done the complete opposite. Has denied that he's lost. Has done everything in his power to try to say that he's won. And I'm not going to sit here and say from day one that I was going to go ahead and say, oh, yeah, Biden's won, you got no proof. No, I was willing to listen. Just like most of us Americans should have been. I mean, if you're claiming there's election fraud, we need to hear about it. I'm not going to argue with you there. If there is claims of election fraud, we need to check into that, because that is an issue. If there is election fraud, that is definitely something high crime, that if it is there, we need to know about it, because there's something that needs to be done. But every time when push comes to shove, And it comes time that you got your opportunity to change the results here. You got your opportunity to speak and tell us what you know, what you've supposedly got evidence of. You provide nothing but crap. That's blank, blah. Got no point. Well, not no point, but what would be the word here? No facts. Barely. But in my opinion, I think it's a crying shame that after 220 years, we've had a president who basically just throws this tradition out the door and blatantly just ignores it. I think it's a crying shame, and I'm sure there are others that think that way too. Now, I know not everyone does, but in my eyes, that's my belief. And I'm quite disturbed by what I see going on in that White House right now. I'm very disturbed at what I'm seeing. It's actually kind of scaring me a little bit. So I caution that if the current state of things, I caution that if Trump wants to go out on a good note, he might want to edit his strategy just a little bit, or else it could hurt him even more. He will always have his supporters. Every president does. But you can't always depend on your supporters alone to win the presidency. You have to be willing to adapt a little bit and gain some of those moderates, some of those people that lie in between that could go either way. That's what you want to target as well, because you'll always have your supporters. But you want to make sure you're grabbing some of those moderates as well, because that's what's going to tip it in your favor. And when you're doing this, you might be pushing more and more of them away. But anyway, I thought that was something that we need to be touched on, because that's a precedent that Adams set. And it's very relatable to what's going on right now in the country. It's very relatable. So Adams loses re-election in 1800. He loses it by a small margin, which means he's the first one-term president we ever get. And he is the first to lose a re-election bid. But as we mentioned, he sets that precedent by peacefully conferring and transferring that power. Now, fun fact, just a couple days before the presidential election of 1800, Adams actually, on November 1st, moved into Washington, D.C., into the newly completed executive mansion, although it was still not finished on the interior. And Adams became the very first president to live in what would become known as the White House. He was the very first president to live there during the final couple weeks of his presidency. And Adams very much believed that the president's house, or executive mansion as it was called then, had a certain aura about it. He believed that it was a fine thing, that the American people could associate a symbol with the president, a location with the president. And he actually stated in his memoirs that he wrote on the day that he moved into the White House, that he stated that may nothing but good and honest men rule under this roof. And fun fact is, because the interiors were so incomplete, literally the East Room is where Abigail Adams hung their laundry, because it was empty. She had nothing in there. She literally had a big old line set up in there and just doing laundry in the East Room. Just hanging the clothes to dry. Now, before Adams left office in March of 1801, before he left office in March of 1801, Adams made several last few weeks judicial appointments to many of the country's courts, including the Supreme Court when he nominated John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which he was confirmed by the Senate, and he was put on the court as its Chief Justice, as the fourth Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And why did Adams do this? Well, Adams largely did this because he was not the only one to really lose on the 1800 elections. The Federalists in general had become divided by that time, and they lost in landslides in Congress to many Democratic Republicans. The Federalist majority in Congress was gone as well, and the Federalists' power was waning, and Adams kind of saw this as possibly we're going to go out here, and he said we need to maintain some sort of a Federalist ideology somewhere in the country's power system. So he deemed, let me try to do that here with the courts. Just try to get someone that has our mindset on the court. That way we're better represented. These became known as midnight judges because they were appointed at the very last minute, basically, in the last couple weeks of his presidency. And they were highly resented by Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans, but since once the Supreme Court justice is confirmed, unless they choose to step down or die, they can't be removed, or they committed a crime, of course. Now, we mentioned John Marshall, and John Marshall was probably one of Adams's best lasting achievements because he became our longest serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was probably one of our best. He decided many landmark cases during his tenure as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was the Chief Justice long after the Federalist Party had gone extinct. I think they went extinct about the early 1820s, and John Marshall, who was appointed by a Federalist administration who had somewhat of a Federalist ideology, he was on the court until 1835. So from 1801 till 1835, 34 years, this guy was on the court. He was on the court long after the Federalists had died out. He was on the court long after Adams had died. But he was really probably Adams's crowning achievement in the judicial system by preserving someone that had some Federalist ideology in him and his judgments. This was a portrait of John Marshall. We'll kind of discuss him as we get into the 1800s a little bit because he had some landmark cases that came about. But he's our longest-serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was appointed by John Adams as one of the midnight judges in 1801, just before he left office. And right here we have a map of the 1800 Electoral College map. We will show this again when we do Thomas Jefferson. I'll let you do a brief look at it right now because I think we're actually going to do a separate video on the election of 1800 because of just how critical it was. It was a very contested election, and it led to the adoption of the 12th Amendment because there was a very big tie for president and vice president that we eventually decided we need to separate the vote. So this is your Electoral College map of the 1800 election. Go ahead, and if you need to, you can always just pause these things to really look at the Electoral College thing. That's always fine because sometimes that actually is better. But anyway, Adams leaves office in March of 1801, and he is 65 years old. He also establishes the tradition that he does attend his successor's inauguration. He does, even though he's not on the best of terms with Jefferson, even though he doesn't really talk to him at all, he goes to Jefferson's inauguration, and he does send Jefferson a letter congratulating him on winning the presidency, but Jefferson never actually replies. And this kind of will come to dominate his retirement. Keep in mind, he's 65 years old when he leaves the presidency. He and Abigail then retired back home to Quincy, Massachusetts, at their home of Peacefield, their manor little house that they had that they called Peacefield. Now, the primary aspect that came to dominate Adams's retirement was not political, but it was his old friendship with Thomas Jefferson. It was really a true success story of reconciliation with each other. Between Jefferson assuming the office in 1801, when Adams left, and 1812, Adams and Jefferson, who had once been the best of friends, who had been kind of separated during the 1790s by these big old political debates, when they kind of fell on opposite political scales, they had no communication with each other for, we might as well say, 11 years. These best friends did not talk at all to each other, didn't write each other, nothing. They acted like they absolutely hated each other, and they had once been the best of friends. And it was kind of very sad that this had occurred. And it was in 1812, in January of 1812, that one of Adams's friends kind of convinced him, and he was a mutual friend of them both. He knew both Jefferson and Adams, and he kind of convinced Adams to make the first move. He said, "You two got to reconciliate. You can't let political divides separate the friendship that you two once had." And Adams was the very first to kind of concede this, and he's like, "You're right." And in January of 1812, he officially writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson and sends it through the mail down to Virginia, where Jefferson lived at his little mansion of Monticello. And surprisingly, Jefferson replies to this letter that was addressed, like wishing him a happy new year, and everything else. And for the next 14 years, they constantly wrote letters to each other back and forth. Jefferson and Adams constantly kept in communication with each other. They maintained their correspondence, and they repaired their relationship that they had become so strained. And both of them kind of watched what they talk about. They avoided talking about their political beliefs, and they kind of focused more on what they were doing in their daily lives, what their philosophies were, what they thought had gone right during the Revolution, and all that. But they very much avoided their political beliefs because they both kind of recognized that was what had started the whole separation in the first place. But Adams was somewhat more willing to want to discuss it. He kind of, in one of the letters, he kind of wrote to Jefferson, and he kind of claimed to him, he's like, you and me ought not to die before at least explaining ourselves to each other, why we did certain things. And Jefferson kind of declined, and he reported back to him, he's like, we don't need to do that. In 1818, Abigail died, which left John heartbroken, and basically he was still communicating with Jefferson, and of course this became evident in the letters that he was quite heartbroken when he lost his wife, which left him with his children. He lived long enough, thankfully though, to see his son, John Quincy, become the 6th president in 1820 by winning the election in 1824. He did live to see his son become president. However, Adams died 2 years later during his son's presidency on July 4th of 1826 at the age of 90. Until Ronald Reagan had surpassed age 90 in 2001, at which he didn't die until 2004, Adams was our oldest president until Ronald Reagan surpassed that in 2001. Also of note was Adams died on July 4th. Of 1826, and this is significant because, as we recall, Adams had been a prominent figure in the Revolution, and he had signed the Declaration of Independence. He had helped Jefferson to kind of draft it a little bit, and he was still best friends with him. And ironically, July 4th of 1826 was also the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, America's 50th birthday. And Adams was very happy. Toward his end, it is reported that he was very happy. He was at home, surrounded by his family, and he was very happy that it was the 4th of July. I honestly don't think there would have been a day that he would have rather have gone. And he died peacefully at home in his bed at the age of 90. And ironically, his last words were that he died, I think, around 6 or 7 p.m. that day, and his last words, ironically, were, Thomas Jefferson still survives. The very sad part was he did not have any clue that just hours before he had said, just hours ago, when he said those words, and then he died just a couple minutes later, just hours before Adams had died, Jefferson had died as well. Ironically, the two best friends died on the very same day of the same year, just hours apart. Jefferson died just hours before Adams did. But Adams did not know that, of course, because the mail system isn't the best. And they didn't have cell phones, so of course Adams did not know that when he said that. So when he said that Thomas Jefferson still survives, he probably didn't realize till he got up to heaven. He's like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? Oh, I guess we just died together. Darn, I said you were still alive when I left. But anyway, that's some fun little factor on their death date, is ironically that both of them died on the very same day, of the very same year, on a very important day that had very much of a relation to both of them. So again, this is John Adams. He was our second president, our first vice president, and one of our best founding fathers, in my personal opinion. Very respected man. But that concludes this video here today. I kind of delved a little more into Adams' retirement in his early pre-presidential years because of the fact that there really wasn't a massive amount during his presidency, given he was a one-term president. There wasn't a massive amount that went on during his presidency, so I just kind of filled in the blanks with what information we could get from other fields of his life. So I felt that would kind of just make sure we had a good enough video for today. So that concludes the second president of the United States from 1797 to 1801. Our third president, when we do him, that will be Thomas Jefferson, who ironically gains the presidency in 1800 through a very contested election, which we will actually have the election of 1800 video up before we do Jefferson. And I hope that will hopefully come next week. But also next week, the video that's going to take first priority is, of course, Monday, I believe, is the December 7th. So, of course, if you live here in the United States, you definitely know what that date is. That is the anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 by the Empire of Japan, which brought the United States into World War II. So we will have a video explaining Pearl Harbor coming out hopefully on Monday itself. So we will definitely have a video on Pearl Harbor next week, and I hope to get the election of 1800 video in next week as well. So that is what next week's plans are at this point. So if you have any comments, be sure to leave that in the comments section. If you like the video, be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to give the thumbs up, as you would call it. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you're liking any of the videos that are coming out. If you got any suggestions, put them in the comment section too. That basically wraps it up here. So I think, let me think here. Nothing else? No. So next week we'll have Pearl Harbor and the election of 1800 videos. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week and a good weekend. And we will hopefully see you back here for the Pearl Harbor video when that comes out here next week. So have a good day, and may God bless you all.